Yeah, tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, in this, the fifth episode of A View from Afar for 2023, political scientist Dr. Paul Buchanan and I will analyse how a real war of global proportions has been waged to shape opinions. Paul and I will deep dive into the battle to control a narrative waged by all sides in a polarised, combative world, and how modern mainstream media institutions, like the Radio New Zealand issue this last couple of weeks, fall vulnerable in the absence of robust, all sides considered analysis and debate. Now, in this episode, we will analyse how fourth estate bias, propaganda, and conflict force fact vacuums are the challenge of our times in this disinformation age. And upon this context, we will consider the following questions. Why is the Radio New Zealand sub-editor pro-RU content debacle symptomatic of a fact vacuum environment? And why is all media vulnerable to disinformation in the absence of robust NATO-Ukraine-Russia analysis? And we will go into that very, very deeply. Also, what are the unspoken of big picture shifts in Russian Federation global South relations? And Paul will take us through that, which is a fascinating concept and one that's very important that dovetails in to understanding the results of the previous two questions we just asked there of ourselves. Now, before we cross to Paul, here's an invitation to you, those of you who are live with us now in the recording of this podcast. Do feel free to interact with us while you are live and while we are live on YouTube and Facebook, although YouTube is the best for this. And remember, if you do make comments or lodge questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. So with all that said, let's cross to Paul Buchanan and we will dig down deep into these big issues. Kia ora koutou, Paul. How are you, Eho?
Kia ora, Selwyn. Great to see you again, and welcome to the audience out there. If I'm looking a little hazy, it's because I'm in a cloud at the moment. My house sits at 700 feet above sea level, and the cloud covers about 500 feet and raining. And between the tower where the Wi-Fi signal comes off and me is a lot of grayness. So I may fluctuate as the ceiling lifts, but it is what it is when you live out on the Auckland West Coast. So, but in any event, great to be here. Absolutely fantastic subject to discuss. Our audience probably knows that you and I talk about it earlier in the week. And I'm privileged to have you here because our conversation on Tuesday was illuminating, to say the least. And I'm hoping you're going to share your knowledge with the rest of these nice folk. But so where do you want to begin, Selwyn? It's obviously started with that RNZ controversy.
Yes, yeah, most definitely. And I just wanted to thank those that are live already have been putting some comments in there, in particular David Mooring. And we'll get back to you, David, and keep the conversation going online. We really appreciate that. And others too. Thank you very much. And let's cross back to you, Paul, and let's allow you to give a context to the Radio New Zealand issue as it evolved and as you interacted with it to assist it in many ways and providing an attempt at getting a more robust and broader reportage of the issue. But anyway, so while I'm talking in abstract terms in some ways, let you present it to the audience so that they know exactly what we're talking about here.
Sure, especially for our foreign audiences who may not realize what this all is about. So a few weeks back, the story broke that a Radio New Zealand sub-editor on their digital platform, so not the broadcast side, but the digital side, because Radio New Zealand puts out stories and whatnot on that digital platform. The story broke that a sub-editor was altering foreign source stories, in particular one from Reuters, about the Ukrainian-Russian war, and that he was actually inserting phrases that were pro-Russian and in some instances appeared to be direct copies of Russian propaganda into otherwise, at least from a Western perspective, would seem to be neutral and balanced stories. And as that story about this, plagiarism slash cut and paste revisionism grew, it turns out he had done that to a number of stories, not just about the Ukrainian-Russian war. There was stories that he had altered about Israel and Palestine. Anyway, a number of them. He appeared to be pro-Russian, pro-Palestinian, and lo and behold, one of the stories that he altered was a story that featured me. And that story originally came from the New Zealand Herald. And basically, what it was some well known leftists in New Zealand feel that we're too close to the Ukraine. We accept the Western narrative. We're biased, and some were biased. And so the story originated with interviews with these two well known leftists. I have regard for both of them. I don't agree with them, but they're good people. We just differ in our opinions. And as part of that story, they sought some balance. Again, this is the New Zealand Herald story, not the RNZ version. And so they brought me in. They brought a security analyst from Victoria University. They brought the foreign minister in for quotes. And I thought the article in the end came out very balanced. It started with the leftist critique, and then it moved into me and these other people saying, well, to say that the Ukrainians are somehow responsible for all of this and it's all NATO's fault is a little bit off, more along those lines. It turns out when that story was syndicated to Radio New Zealand, this same sub-editor stripped out my comments, the comments by the security specialist, and by the foreign minister. So it was just the two leftists airing their complaints that New Zealand was biased. And again, it may or may not be true. I happen to disagree with them, but there you go. As a follow-up to all of that kerfuffle, which now had metastasized into a dozen stories that have been altered after the fact. And again, this is others people's work that has been altered after the fact without attribution and without their consent. That to me was the big issue, not the slant that was given by the sub-editor. But as part of that, they aired an interview with me. They did a live interview with me a couple of Mondays ago, in which the morning show host was asking me about, what I knew, etc. And as a sidebar to all of this, I had been approached by reporters about whether or not Russian disinformation could have been at play, because I now write a little bit about psychological operations as they materialize in misinformation and disinformation. It's just a new version of psychological operations. And I pointed out that I didn't know this man's motivations. It may or may not be related to disinformation, but two things can be true at the same time. We can be awash in disinformation, not just Russian. I mean, let's be very frank. The United States puts out some dodgy stuff. The Israelis, the Iranians, it's the Chinese. It's a game now that is being played heavily all over the world. We can be awash in disinformation, and yet this individual may not have used disinformation purposefully. He may have come to his own conclusions, grabbed some stories from other sources, and inserted them into the story about Ukraine and Russia. To my mind, it's grossly unethical from a journalistic standpoint, and I'm less interested in the particular slant. I just don't think you alter people's work without their consent. And it's kept on growing since then. So I put the interview up on the Kiwi Politico site, and then you and I talked about it. And I thought, Selwyn is a legit journalist. I mean, for those of you who don't know Selwyn as well as I do, this guy is old school. He's been in newsrooms, of the old type. And so he knows the whole part. What else have you been? You've been an editor, you've been a platform owner, you've been a producer. Anyway, Selwyn has done the whole chain in the news cycle. And now he's on podcasts. So I thought, rather than have a guy like me who's just a talking head have a real journalist address these issues. So on Tuesday, Selwyn and I said, so, this is my slant. I think that the guy violated journalistic ethics 101, and I'm not interested in this pro-Russian thing. It could have been about anything. It could have been about pizza. And then you explained to me in lucid terms what exactly you felt was going on and that there was a larger issue at stake. And so I'm hoping that I can give way to you and you can explain to them, i.e., our audience, what you explained to me the other day, because quite frankly, I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah. I just got an insect just leapt at me. the pleasures of live broadcasting, Paul. Thanks for that introduction on it and some of the the background. I guess a lot of just for those that are overseas too, where I'll come from is dipping into the master's thesis that I did that examined from a communication point of view, not just within the media environment, but also with the other pillars of institutions within democracies, of how black flag operations can occur and disinformation campaigns can be engineered overseas remotely, but have huge impacts within a country like New Zealand and others within, say, a Western kind of configuration. So what we're talking here too, and in the first instance, let's just address the issues of sub-editors. Now, there are different approaches that sub-editors, different purposes that sub-editors have within newsrooms, depending on the structures and the resource and also the type of product that the newsroom is putting out. If we look in general terms in newspapers of old, the journalists would do all the journalist work, like we're all well used to understanding. The copy or the article, if you want to put it that way, would be finished. It would be sent to a sub-editor generally first off. The guidance would be there with the chief reporter, the senior other reporters, and certainly the editor that may be overlooking news editor. But the sub-editor's job was to look at correcting any ambiguities, have a local knowledge or a knowledge of the issue, and be able to address those within the body of work to make sure it met the standards of the organisation and the purpose of the organisation and the audiences of that organisation. The sub-editor in general in newspapers traditionally has been basically the last set of eyes before it goes out onto getting printed or, in this case, onto websites in the modern environment. And in the RNZ situation, what we found is the sub-editors is generally on New Zealand domestic issues and articles have two sets of eyes that will look at it. In my view, that's really important. And it looked like with international wire type accessed or externally accessed information, RNZ had one sub-editor basically looking at it. And I think this is where the problem comes in. Now, within the culture of sub-editors, many believe and have experienced in the New Zealand media context and overseas too, that the sub-editor can often change that written article from what the journalist has written or the contributor has written quite considerably, to the point as a journalist, often in the newsrooms, we would be cringing when the product came out in the newspapers or a magazine or whatever, because we'd be thinking, what have the sub-editors done to our work? And to the point where sometimes you didn't even recognise your own work and your name would be on it. There were often times where you'd go and apologise to those that you'd sourced information from because of what had happened to it during that chain of information flow. Now, that's some of the problems there. I wonder that whether or not this is what Radio New Zealand is facing in the context of what Paul has laid out. That the sub-editor in this case is the last set of eyes. It's an externally sourced information that is relevant to overseas issues. The sub-editor there is the only set of eyes in that case, of which RNZ, as I understand it, is addressing that. And in my view, Paul, and this is an opinion of which I would push amongst journalist fraternities, that it is not so much correcting the copy, the article, that the sub-editors are purposed at. But in cases like this, in a disinformation age, you need another sub-editor to basically watch what the other one is doing. And that's where the problem is, in my view, that there is too much responsibility on one person in this case, of which has been thinking, perhaps, I don't know the person myself personally, but I would imagine they're thinking, this particular piece is not doing it from my point of view. My base of knowledge in this issue suggests that it needs this or it needs that taken out. And that sub-editor, for all we know, may have been trying in an attempt to do what he had been doing for years. And that lies the problem with the structures in media organisations that rely on that type of structure. I know that when I was working in newspapers at the time, and it was owned externally by the Murdoch groups at the time, sometimes what you saw in that newspaper didn't reflect anything near your reportage. And there was an effort to tidy up shop in that way. While the structures remained the same, there was a man from the Oregonian in the United States on the West Coast, Oregon, their major newspaper. And the Oregonian at that time was the investigations editor was a guy called Jack Hart. Now, Jack Hart had created some very, very, very deep and meaningful investigations that necessitated and insisted that the information of which was gathered by journalists be exactly what the audience gets to see. And he was doing long form, using the same techniques, basically, his team was, as Mark Twain and others, that would develop the characters, not just by name and title and place and circumstance, but develop the characters in a way that you really understood who they were. So it was long-form investigative journalism, not just a body of fact and reportage. Now, he came up with the term front-end editing, and what they were doing to try and minimise the dangers of it being lost or abused in a sub-editor type structure was what they called front-end editing. The sub-editors could have their play, and the editor can look over it if they so wish, but it had to go back to the journalists and Jack Hart's team before it went out into the newspaper. Now, that obviously takes time, and I can see this happening in some of the major newspapers in Germany at the moment. I can see that Deutsche Welle, for example, seems to have an element of structural front-end editing occurring as well. I think it's vital in a disinformation age, and we'll talk to that disinformation in a very close moment. But, these kind of principles, the other thing I'd just like to talk about, Paul, is within a fact vacuum, within a country like New Zealand and other Western allied states as well, like Australia, certainly Japan, certainly the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States, where a government has taken a particular line for whatever reason, maybe good reasons, maybe bad, about another country, and where the public has sympathies and understands and agrees with where a government is positioned, and where generally mainstream news media has accepted that, yes, this is the particular angle and the view and the bias of which we will attract to a particular area, and we can deal that down to, in the Ukraine sense, many see that Ukraine as a sovereign nation was being invaded by a strong and opposing force, and therefore the atrocities that were occurring on Ukrainian soil against Ukrainian people and infrastructure and environment required a response from a government, from a peoples, and from a media that had common ground. And that's what we have seen, a common ground on human rights principles, on environmental principles, and on Western NATO-aligned biases as well. So within that context, a lot of the reportage, in particular in countries like New Zealand, Australia, United States, etc., have focused on the Ukrainian side of things. But we don't understand what the compulsion, what is happening within Russia, within the Russian Federation, how the regime, the Putin regime, controls the Federation, and how the people are estranged from really having a say in what is going on in their name. And all of these types of things. There is no real balance in there, or not even achievable balance can occur in an information vacuum like that, where the biases are laid up by tiers, if you like. So if you're looking at that, you can look abroad and you can see, once again, I'll cite Germany and France, of making huge efforts to try and get to understand what is the opposing force here. Yes, they have a particular side that they support for the reasons of which we've just outlined before, but to understand where the other side is coming from, what are the conditions of which the other side may start to ease back or enter into a dialogue? How do you sift through into finding what is fact out of a disinformation operation that is coming from that opposing force? And in Europe, and in those two countries in Europe in particular, what they've been doing is latching on to academics who have had huge successes and reputations that have been built. They're Russian nationals inside the Russian university institution. They have found themselves labeled by the Putin regime as foreign agents, and they're in exile in places like Berlin, Paris, etc., and Switzerland and others. And they have a body of knowledge of which those European media are using to try and unpick the disinformation and to sift through to see what the realities are, what the compulsions are, what the limits of Russian aggression are, and really looking forward to the point of where are the resolution points. That's an absence in countries like New Zealand. And I think with a disinformation campaign that has been raging and a fact-based vacuum that exists in this country, where everybody is too shy to actually examine what the compulsions are of the opposing forces, then it breeds a situation where a sub-editor who may have even professional biases of wanting to balance or sympathies toward what is opposing forces here, like the Russian Federation, falls into a situation of trying to create a balance. And then from that person's point of view. So you can see what I've been talking about is quite a broad kind of approach that goes down into inadequacies within the media or journalistic or mainstream media structures as well. And those kind of debates are starting to happen thanks to Radio New Zealand being honest and open about what it had found within its own nest, if you like. Paul, there may be issues that need clarification or there's some that I've left out. I'm not too sure, but I'll leave that for you to determine on the audience's behalf.
Yeah, let me just give a couple of points of order, and then I will throw it back to you though. But I'll lead you into it this time. So the interesting thing is that the sub editor in question, when questioned by another reporter, said, "Oh, but I've been doing this for 5 years, and there's never been a complaint." Now you've just explained that in the digital medium in New Zealand, apparently the sub editor is the last word, and he can put his own words instead of those of others. Now, having come out of academia, I just cringed because I'm like, you're inserting your words without attribution, and you're not seeking the consent of the original authors. That gets you fired in academia
Yeah, for
right
good
away. So
reasons.
I thought, well, but I know you, so I'm like, well, Selwyn's an ethical guy. Let's see how he feels. Now, interestingly, and this is just a sidebar, but as soon, after the story broke, the first thing that happened was they tried to find the identity of the sub editor, which they did unearth. Then they went into smearing him because they said, oh, it turns out he was born in Northern Ireland and he really doesn't like the English. And oh, he altered and put pro-Palestinian stuff way before he put pro-Russian stuff. And I thought, now you're playing the man, not the journalistic ethics. Okay, it doesn't matter what his motivations were. The fact is, being Northern Irish is irrelevant. Again, where he got his sense of balance is less important to me than that there was an institutional structure that allowed him uh, legitimately in the eyes of RNZ on the digital side to alter stuff in the interest of balance. But that's where I'm going to throw it back to you, because one of the things you said to me on
The
Tuesday,
balances.
yeah, I said to you, yeah, but sometimes you can't balance. It's like this argument about who do you debate. I'm not going to debate a Nazi. I'm not going to debate an anti vaxxer. Okay. I don't deal with lunatics. I come in, I try to ground myself in the facts. I'll tell you when I have an opinion, but I'm not going to deal with lunatics. So I was saying to you, look at Selwyn. Sometimes you don't go after balance because the other side is nuts. I mean, this
Yeah.
Kennedy guy running against Joe Biden in the primary, he's certifiable. Who would want to debate this nutter? But your answer to me when I said, sometimes we don't need the balance and what have you, I thought was very instructive, and I'm hoping that you'll share it with the audience, because that was illuminating, the whole issue of balance or whether or not you need it. So on that note, can you explain me the difference between balance,
Yeah.
objectivity, and fairness?
Yeah, well, objectivity and balance are close bedfellows, let's put it in that way. And fairness is another way of structuring the output. In the first instance of dipping into that, you've got to understand the symbiotic relationship that occurs between an audience and a media organisation, and also the brand of media organisations, so where they're coming from. I mean, you can get a far right media organisation, or you can get right leaning media organisations, put it like that way, like the platform here in New Zealand, for example. From their point of view, they are putting some sort of right wing balance into the debate within New Zealand. So, understanding what the media organisation is and the audience of which it feels naturally attracted to. Therefore, there's a symbiotic relationship where that audience gravitates to that. So, just putting that to bed and getting an understanding of attempts at balance. But generally, in many cases, and some would argue against what I'm going to say here, and that's their prerogative. My observations, experience, and also um, belief in this case, in this side of media, is that objectivity is a myth. In my view, that is generally understood and accepted, particularly amongst journalists and media, senior media people in all the Western democracies. That objectivity was a myth, that it was put to bed at least by the early 1990s, because within objectivity, that suggests that the person is putting the article together, the reporter, the sub-editor, the editors, they don't have any buy-in to the issue at all. They're totally agnostic at best. That they're like just robots or drones that are sitting there pulling in the information, putting it out there. Now, that's objectivity is an absolute joke. It doesn't occur. Everybody in the information chain has their bias. Even if they don't understand what that bias is, they feel comfortable within the value judgments of which their family has injected into them, their communities, their culture. Those biases exist in everybody. Objectivity cannot be achieved. So let's just put that to the side. Then you've got an issue of balance, and that's something that was pursued for a long time. And that is basically, like, that was a good example that you gave with Biden and Kennedy's thing. You've got a candidate there that's not going to win, getting the to represent the Democratic Party in the United States. Very extreme. And people generally think he has a constituency because it's a large population, but nowhere near the current president's constituency within the party. Now, what do? Do you legitimise the arguments by a 50-50 balanced split? Well, that's up to the media organisation to judge. Some that would, perhaps they're on the fringe, some media organisations, they think, yeah, that Kennedy dude, he's actually speaking a truth here. They may give more than 50% to the guy and Biden a cursory glance with a couple of paragraphs out of 12. And that kind of thing, once again, is an issue of the attempts at balance being a joke. It just doesn't happen. There are attempts, if you're doing court reporting and crime reporting, for example, where it's important to make sure that there are things that are observed relating to balance. What I'm talking about here doesn't exclude it, but generally speaking, the attempts at this person is saying that person says this, we're balanced it because we put both sides in an equal measure. It doesn't stack up. In today's professional news environment, where it's preparing information for its public, it is more wise to try and put a fairness in, and it might not be necessarily fair to the voices that are being reported within the body of work, but fairness to the audience, that these journalists and this media organisation, for whatever reason, have made a decision where we're going to dig down here deep in the interests of the audience, in the interest of fourth estate fairness, and we are looking at the issue and we see the proportions of importance in this way, and that's how we're going to report it. So once again, to recap, objectivity, it's a myth. It cannot be sustained. It's a ridiculous concept and at best. Balance, it has its place, but it can be a futile exercise when you're trying to present what is important facts and fact-checked facts before an audience. Fairness is the way, fair to the person who's investing their time to read or view or listen to a particular piece of work, being fair to them that you're not going to waste their time, and fair to the people that have been used as contacts or sources, and fair to the fact-checking efforts that have gone on by the professional organisation or journalists as well. All of those things. I am one of those that subscribe to the principles of fairness that outweigh all of those other two, Paul. And I hope I've explained that in a way. If there's anything else relating to that you think need to touch on, I'd be happy to do so.
Well, I'll tell you, at first, when you started talking about objectivity, I thought you were going to go all postmodern on me and tell me there's no objective truth. Now, interestingly, when I used to teach the university, I would talk about subjective assessments of objective phenomena. And you actually covered it based on your culture, your gender. I mean, we bring subjectivity to our observations of the objective world. And I would use as the example, you take four blind guys and you have them feel up an elephant. They're going to describe four different creatures. One of them is going to be really scared. But the point is, four blind men touching an elephant will describe four different things. Our subjective assessments of objective phenomena lead us to different conclusions. And so I agree with you that objectively, literally, is in the eye of the beholder. And I like the idea that we morph towards fairness. Now, this is where disinformation comes in. Steve Bannon said it best. He said, look it, you fill the environment with BS. And so that you can no longer discern the truth from fiction, and you actually write the fiction better than the truth. So you write better stories that are conspiracy theories, are fantastic, but they grab the eye, they grab the reader's, or the listener's attention. And then you allow them, and many, most of the public don't have training in journalistic ethics and that sort of thing, to figure out fact from fiction, to figure out what they like. And it plays on subjectivities, which in many cases are prejudices and biases. And that's where we start siloing or compartmentalizing out. We listen to the news that confirms our biases. We start, segregating out into little tribal camps based upon the information that we choose to receive, because the corporate media now is competing for eyeballs and clicks and all of that with social media. And social media clearly doesn't have the journalistic ethics or strictures that we teach in journalism schools, and that anyone with a platform can go out there and say anything.
And this is one of, just to jump in on that just very quickly, I'll just add, because it's an important point to observe, that within the social media phenomenons, what it has done is sharpened and honed news media organisations to start to analyse what their real purpose is within a fourth estate principle. So, they look at that and they think, okay, well, here's the difference between professional journalism, professional media, and all of that's going on out there. And, and the blog phenomenon is another one too, generally opinion-based type things that may or may not be supported by facts. So the media organisations do have a role in current affairs and public discourse, the public sphere, as wonderful people like Wayne Hope like to refer to. The news media has a very big role in being able to develop into professional assessors of what is being presented, because this is going to get more and more and more challenging with the advent of AI in these spaces as well. Now, what I like about all of this, and I won't divert away from what you're saying because I just wanted to inject in, but one of the good things about this podcast that I enjoy, Paul, is we always look at solutions within the challenges. And the challenges that we're looking at clearly at the moment are, and I've got on my list there in great big letters, it is about the disinformation age, of which is coming at people from all sides. How do you sift through all of that? There are two pillars of institutions, I believe, that are equipped to do that, and it's not government. It is academia in its pure sense and in its committed sense, and a professional news media, where the challenges of deciding what are relevant, what is fair to the audience and important in the national and public interest, and observing those principles and going forward with that. And I just point for those that are live and also, that come back to this on demand on YouTube, David Mooring and others are having a great debate about solutions to these things. And I'll just inject in there, David Mooring says, if the New Zealand media that we're using as a case study here, aren't we, Paul? That is representative of many in the West. If the New Zealand media, David Mooring says, claim they don't have the resources to fact check, then maybe there's a need for a fact checking co-op. Now, I like what David's saying there, and it's not necessarily extreme. We had these in New Zealand with NZPA, the Press Association, for example, in a sense where you could rely on its reportage that it has done a robust job of pulling out, and it was information of which could be relied on, that mainstream media organisations all had part ownership in. Now that's gone here in New Zealand. Australia has its counterpart still in existence, but with stresses, but it's still very important. And certainly in the United States, it has its wire counterparts in such ways. So jumping into fact-checking co-ops is not an extreme solution at all. I think there's merit in what David is saying. He says, for example, set up 3 full-time, well-funded but independent fact-checking units. Bring it up on screen here so people can see it. In Auckland, Wellington and Dunedin. Those are major cities in New Zealand, for those that are listening or will see this on demand later. And have them respond to queries from the news media, politicians and social media. That would be a real contribution to, one, the national interest and also the public interest on such things. Now, there's others like Matthew Graces who's making comments in there as well while Paul and I are recording this live. It's a really good debate. People join in if you wish to, and I'll just pass it back to Paul, who can pick up again. Now, Paul, let's look at the disinformation age, and you as an academic, do you believe that the news media in Europe that I was talking about, where they're sourcing the views and analysis of academics from their areas of specialisation as a counter to the disinformation and to sift through what's real and what isn't? Do you think that there's merit in that from the point of view of public and national interest?
Oh well, there's certainly merit in it, but I would put a couple of caveats to this. The first one is that academia is not immune to the clickbait phenomena, and I'll just tell you a story that was a major scandal in the social sciences about a year and a half ago. So it turns out that the big academic journals, let's say the American Journal of Political Science, those sort of things, they've all gone digital, and they're very expensive. Their individual subscriptions are $800 a year for 4 issues, that sort of thing. And in response, editors of these journals have started to accept articles that don't have scholarly merit, but are controversial. So they generate clicks. And the one that was the case that I'm referring to was a fellow wrote an article for a major journal, which basically there was a provocative title such as "Colonialism Was Good." And then he argued that before the Western colonialists showed up, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, they were subhuman people living in the mud. It was really grotesque. And that if it wasn't for the white man showing up, they'd still be in the mud. And anyway, it was outrageous. It was outrageous. But the title was provocative. The content, again, was outrageous. and it generated thousands of eyeballs, and the advertisers responded to the clicks. So the journal received an influx of revenue because so many people, mostly outraged, went to read the article. And eventually there was a huge debate and it was eventually taken down, but the damage was done. This journal will not recover its reputation. And so that gave everybody pause because it turns out the editor of the journal and the author of the article had been university mates. So it got more unethical the more you dug into it. But there is that problem. Now, in New Zealand, it's compounded by the fact that our universities are systemically under resourced, grossly so. And increasingly, academics, and I'm married to one, I'm married to a political scientist, are told not to write books and not to write academic articles, but get in the media, write op-eds, go on social media platforms that are not refereed. So you just put up what are essentially opinion pieces, and those will count as research output for promotion purposes. Those are not research outputs. That's not original, you're just giving opinions and what have you. And the professors who are rewarded are the ones who show up on TV and talk about anything, whether they know it or not. And we've got a few of those here in New Zealand. And they get the attention, they get promoted. And the real scholars wind up struggling, and many of them eventually leave. I mean, we've had an exodus of good New Zealand academics leaving for foreign shores because we're so underfunded and the priorities are wrong. So I would argue that the trouble is not just with the media, but the inability of an honest media. And I include social media. I mean, I include blogs and whatnot, but people with some integrity, they don't have the ability to confront the tidal wave of misinformation and disinformation generated by this urge to get out in front of everybody else on the topic of the day. And that's the important thing. One of the things you mentioned to me the other day was that, well, you mentioned it today. You talked about long-term investigations. We don't have time for long-term investigations anymore. The editors are on your back saying this has got to be out by yesterday. And apparently, in the case of the sub-editor at RNZ, he felt pressure to produce stories, X amount of stories per day. And so, all the timelines on producing a story of any worth are now heavily compressed because of the competition for clicks and eyeballs. So the stories get shallower, they get more controversial. There's no real digging in many places. And so, in a weird sense, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. People who teach at Harvard will always have the money to do long form research and write good books. But people in the university system in New Zealand, we don't have Harvard's money. Nowhere. In fact, the 8 New Zealand universities together don't have the money that one good private school in the United States has. And that is also true for New Zealand trying to keep up with European universities. If our universities are succumbing to what I would call the clickbait phenomena, then it's a stretch to expect that the media, which the universities produce, are going to be better than that. That they somehow are going to overcome this slide in academia and be better and have more integrity and that sort of thing. So, and this is where Steve Bannon is an evil genius, because in that environment where academic research and writing standards are slipping, where the media is competing for eyeballs and clicks, you flood the space. What you said, it was an information vacuum. You flood the space with all sorts of nonsense and rubbish and whatnot.
Yeah,
The more
because
salacious,
vacuums, and like in the pure sciences, is the same in political science. It's the same in media communication sciences. that vacuum will be filled. Paul, I pick up your point very strongly. What I'll just bring up is what they're doing in Europe. And remember, we're living in an age where you don't necessarily need to be constrained within the institutions of your own territorial waters. So, what are they doing, for example? Where are we? We're bringing it up on screen. Yeah, over in Germany now, Dakota here. Dakota. So you can see that's the title up here. It makes huge efforts in getting to understand Belarus and Russia. Now, it's in German, but it is sourcing, for example, information of which respected political scientists, respected academics, respected media types within those kind of funding entities, where they see things, where a lot of their own kind of analysis and investigation has led them. Now, it may be something that is to be challenged within the pieces, but Dakota's got a specialist board of journalists, and one is a colleague and a friend of mine, Ingo Petz, who specialises in Belarus and is fluent in Russian and Belarusian and Ukrainian, and he's based in Berlin, and he is very much comfortable within the Dakota type of media organisation, even though it's relatively small compared to the big mastheads. Because there's specialisation in existence, and they're tapping into those sources of information, making sense of all of the disinformation, putting out what's rubbish, and having fact-based analysis as a consequence. Now that's Dakota. I'll just bring in another one here. And this is interesting. This is Medusa, which as a media organisation was banned very early in with the advent of Putin's operation war against Ukraine. Sociologist here, Gregory Yudin, is well respected within European circles because of his analysis in understanding the inside pressure points, the inside motivations, the tripwires, all of the things that influence decisions by Putin and his regime. And also where the weak points are, where the strong points are, and the divisions are. And these kind of articles that are reasonably recent are going into where are they now? What comes next? All of those open analytical questions are being considered. I'm bringing up on screen for those that are here in a live context and also watching the video live, but we will have links in the written part so that those that are listening to it on demand can access this too. Here's one in the New Yorker in the United States. The New Yorker is using the same way of trying to, I'll just put the promo for a subscription down, to try and understand what is going on. What is the opposing side's situation? What do they think? And that's where they've gone in and started to quiz and really dig into the work of Tatiana Staninova, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center and has dug into really what is going on within that Putin regime. Is it doomed to fail is the headline. That is the question that they basically analyse in that piece. There's stuff out there that would be great if New Zealand mainstream media that do have a commitment and resource to do something about this information vacuum in this disinformation age, wherever it comes from, the United States, the Western alliances, NATO, Europe, Russian Federation or Ukraine in this context, or the People's Republic of China or anywhere else, that those kind of forms and structures and formats of how to resolve the problem, looking at solutions and moving with efforts to find solutions where they don't stack up. All of this is vital, I think, in this day and age, because at the end of it, all institutions within all of these countries will have a role in trying to find a way back to a peaceful resolution. And what that question is, what is the cost of peace? And those are some of the underlying major issues relating to information, of which must be based on fact and evaluation and analysis of those that are very learned in their specific fields. So those kind of links that I've brought up and we'll put in the body of the podcast may help some people to kind of figure through whether or not they agree with us or whether or not they're against our views on this, Paul. Back to you on let's pick up that really important part about the global south and those points that you're picking up of shifts and making sense of that and really defining what all of this is about with respect to the Russian Federation and the global south.
Sure. Before I do so, let me just point out, I mean, you're very optimistic, Selwyn, but all of the publications that you just listed are elite publications, one that requires translation. And in Anglo-Saxon societies, I really hate to say this and be the negative counterpoint, but all opinions are equally valid. I remember when I first moved to New Zealand, someone said, "Oh, we put our boots on all the same." The anti-intellectualism that is exhibited in the United States, here in New Zealand, where intellectuals are looked on with disdain and what have you, all opinions are not the same. But in the social sciences, everybody's got an equal opinion. You wouldn't go up to an astrophysicist and go, "You know what? I think black holes are in fact white. And I'll explain you my theory of whiteness on black holes." You wouldn't do that. But you ask a political question, you ask a sociological question, you ask an anthropological question, everybody and his second cousin has got an equally valid opinion. And this is what Steve Bannon and his crowd are playing to. I won't say the masses are asses, but when you can't differentiate the opinion of a PhD level trained political science with a few books and all of that sort of thing, and Joe at the end of the pub, bar stool, then you're a society.
Good old Joe. Good old Joe.
Yeah, I mean, so I think we got a cultural problem in the Anglo-Saxon world. I mean, I will point out to you, and I think a lot of people in the Anglo-Saxon world don't know this. In Latin societies, such as those that I grew up in, particularly Argentina and Brazil, intellectuals are revered, and they may not make a lot of money. It's not a commodified relationship, but they are treated with, I mean, astounding respect. I would liken it to the treatment of professional athletes in the United States and New Zealand. I mean, it's truly, to go back there and to see how they look at their intellectuals. And let's be very clear to those who may be Anglo-Saxon chauvinists, Latin societies have produced phenomenal intellectuals for hundreds of years. And so let's not get into the sort of chauvinism that I see all too often in Anglo-Saxon societies. My point of negativity is that until we get over the cultural predisposition to diminish and disparage the opinions of experts in the social sciences, we're never going to get out of this morass. Now, turning to the global south, and I think this is an interesting segue to go to. Many of us in the West, or many people in the West, may think that the majority of the world is behind the Western sanctions regime, that is opposed to the Russian invasion, and are staunch in that regard. The truth is otherwise. 80% of the world are not on board with the sanctioned regime. 80% of the world are either neutral or on Russia's side. And so this is a NATO Anglophone and their allies coalition that is a minority coalition with tremendous economic power, but which is a minority coalition in global affairs. Now you'd say, how can that be? Well, there's actually some fairly easy answers to that, and they go like this. During the Cold War, the United States, other post-colonial societies, supported dictatorships that oppressed their people and which allied with certain economic interests, let's just call a spade and say some capitalist interests that originated in the colonial West and oppressed their people for the economic gain of the dictatorial elites in the countries in question and the economic and political elites of the West. That was the Cold War in the South. And we've talked before how people like Kissinger referred to the world as shadow and peripheral zones. And peripheral zones is where you went down and exploited, and no one was going to argue with you about it. Well, most of sub Saharan Africa, most of Asia, most of South America were such places. And who were the people who funded and armed guerrilla groups, liberation movements, all of those? It was the Russians. It was the Soviets back then, and then to some extent the Chinese. But if you look at countries like Vietnam and Laos, if you look at, well, almost every Latin American country, the movement for liberation, the movement to throw off the yoke of imperialism, was backed not by the United States and NATO. To the contrary, they supported the Somozas and the Marcoses and the Shah of Iran and all those sort of critters.
This is
And
exactly right.
but
In Vietnam, going back almost 30 years, the first thing that was very obvious to me from the point of view of overseas involvement there was the rebuilding that the or the Soviets were doing in Vietnam in the wake of the total annihilation of much of the infrastructure that was left by the West. So I get what you're saying. There's a
yeah,
cultural kind of connection there. I'll just back out again
well,
here from that.
yeah. And so, now we can say, well, I'll give you a real brief anecdote. When I went to the United States to go to university, I took a Latin American class, all right, from an American. And here I'm, someone who has a background with, guerrilla groups in Latin America. And this guy started telling me that telling a class of 30, that the problem in Latin America is communism. And, all that. And so I'm like, excuse me. And I said, I beg to differ. The problem in Latin America is US backed imperialism and dictatorship. And I said, look, the hard fact of the matter is that we've never seen any Russians running around in Latin America. But boy, we've seen U.S. Marines, as soon as you pop your head up and say something bad, i.e., I want to be democratic socialist, then the friggin' Americans show up and they're not being friendly anymore. So for most of the third world, or what was called the third world, and is now the global south, to include India, who knows a little bit about colonialism, most of the world are sitting this one out or are directly siding with the Russians because, perhaps in some cases opportunistically, but in many cases out of a sense of ideological loyalty, these countries feel some respect for the Soviet Union, even though it's now just Russia and Russia is
Yeah.
behaving the way. See, that's
And
where the
there's the
critical.
weird thing comes in. I mean, the Putin regime is so far away from, the regimes that supported these countries. But what hasn't changed is the distrust of the West in such ways. Yeah. And we
Exactly. And
even
what's
see
in
that
there,
in New Zealand, don't we, Paul? We see it in Australia in certain ways, not
yeah,
necessarily represented at government level, but certainly the independent drive or pursuit of it by those in New Zealand is motivated by a distrust of the West,
yeah. Well,
as opposed to connecting to the others.
both you and I have New Zealand friends who hate the United States,
Mm.
absolutely hate it, and it blinds them to that. And to be sure, the United States has a lot to answer for. But beyond the issues of whatabism, that is, the United
Mm.
States behaved in the past, the British behaved bad in the past, so the Russians get a pass on this one. I happen to believe in the perfectibility of humankind. Just because nasty stuff happened in the past doesn't mean that we should allow people to do nasty stuff in the present and future. Many of my mostly leftist friends will say, you know what? You guys invaded Iraq on a pretext. You're just, you're bad, you're hypocritical. So the Russians do get a pass. I can't quite buy into that, but I do understand.
Can I just add a little thing there that I believe the solution to this is not attaching your bias to any particular power, but determining where your guiding principles lie. And this is coming from my media background. If you abide by the principles of human rights, environmentalism, sustainable business practice, etc., 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 you are not captured by institutional or country orientated biases, and you can determine where you position your fairness, if you like, and your fact checking within that paradigm. So I just wanted to add that because we've been talking in media context.
Yeah, no, and very, very, very well said. In fact, the only people who talk that way here in New Zealand are the Greens.
Which I'm not agreeing.
Kudos to them for when they do come up with something interesting. But I thought it would be interesting for our audiences to understand that most of the world is not behind the West when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. Most of the world, I mean, there are opportunists who will side or be neutral, such as the Indians who are straddling the fence while buying massive amounts of Russian gas and oil. There are others where it's a matter of post Soviet ideological loyalty. The Soviets did a solid for the Angolans and the Mozambikians and the South Africans. They were the ones who are helping to liberate these countries. And now there's a return on the favor. So we're not going to see 80% of the world join, the Western side. However, Ukraine has belatedly realized that it's losing the PR war in the global South. And so they've launched a directed PR campaign where Ukrainian ambassadors are going around the world in the South explaining their position as being akin to a newly liberated post-colonial society, going, no, we're closer to you than you are to the Russians.
It's the pursuit of common ground, isn't it, in that respect?
And so we'll see, because the Ukrainians are very adept at getting their point across. It's just like, unlike the West that has the fear of the bear, embedded in it, there is no fear of the Russian bear in places like Angola and Mozambique or Bolivia, or any of these. They don't fear the Russians. They buy, and here's where we get into the disinformation and propaganda campaigns, they buy the narrative that NATO was encroaching on Russia, was preparing to attack Russia, and Ukraine was going to be the fulcrum used against Russia. And so Russia had to act preemptively. They buy that. That is because their histories with the West are tainted by betrayal, hypocrisy, and cruelty. There's no disputing that. As recently as the post 9/11 environment, where the United States and NATO went into Iraq on a pretext. Afghanistan was one thing, but to invent a war and invade a place that had nothing to do with 9/11, that still sits very bitterly with many people around the world. So I say that because in that contested space, it's not exactly a vacuum in the global South, but the Russian narrative resonates better with people than the Western narrative. They see themselves on the side of the traditional liberator of oppressed people, so they're inclined to believe the Russian version of the truth, even though in this particular instance, I and perhaps you as well don't believe the Russian version of the truth. We tend to think that they are the aggressors here. And mind you, we won't even get into talking about democracy, because at that point, a lot of my Latin American counterparts will start laughing. When the Americans start talking about democracy, it's time to laugh. But let's remember something. Nothing has changed with Russia when it comes to governance. The Soviet Union was authoritarian. Russia under Putin is authoritarian.
Personalized autocracy. Yeah.
From the Latin's point of view, that's the Russian style. as long as the Russians support their causes, and the Russians do. See, this is the thing: Russia and China are countries that invest in a lot of the post-colonial world on fairer terms, as it turns out, than whatever Western investment exists. And that's even lapped up on the shores of the South Pacific, because there have been episodic attempts to break away in the South Pacific from the so-called traditional patrons, those being the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, and look towards, as in the case of Fiji, under its look north policy, look towards new patrons in the form of China and Russia. As soon
which
as
is
Fiji
realigned
announced,
most recently after the consequence of the last
yeah,
election in Fiji.
but what happens as soon as Fiji declares that, quest for independence, the traditional patrons all react negatively, because now it's part of a bigger geopolitical game in which places like Fiji are just pawns. They don't matter by themselves. They're just pieces on a bigger chessboard that the United States and its allies are playing against the Chinese and the Russians. Anyway, my point in saying all this is that those of us in the West, we need to take a step back and think long and hard about why the global South is not marching with the Western governments on the side of Ukraine in this particular conflict.
And one of the interesting elements that comes out of that, once you start thinking within that way, Paul, are the solutions from the point of view of a pathway toward resolution or peace going to come out of those states that you're identifying there, as opposed to the West? And if there's momentum, it would suggest that it's those states that are going to be perhaps finding where the common ground toward easement may exist. But those are the big questions, once again, in citing the European context of evaluation of what is going on in that conflict. And those questions are, what does success look like for both sides? And that's where the compromise of the cost of peace elements of debate start to emerge from, in my view. There's a question, I'll address that and then we'll wrap up here. So it's a question from David Mooring. Are there any real left-wing Russian supporters under the age of 50 around the world? Well, I would just refer you to the work of the political scientist Ekaterina Shulman, who we dedicated quite a large part of a previous episode, 2 episodes ago too, where she's a Russian academic who is in exile in Berlin at the moment and is doing a lot of work amongst the respected political science faculties in the universities up there. And she has mapped out ways of identifying demographics of where they sit on exactly this question, or support for the neo-right nationalistic regime of Vladimir Putin, and where does that support come? And in simple terms, David, if you missed that program, she is saying that those of the grandparent generation, of which were young people in their late 30s or early 40s when the Soviet Union was overtaken by Yeltsin's people, that generation is very much in favour of the war and Putin. The parent generation, that 35 up to 60 years of age now, they want it all to stop. The younger ones, beneath 35 and down, they don't want this at all. They are just how you'd imagine any other younger group that has been exposed to the values of globalization and how they sit. They just want to get on in their lives and to have a shot at life, not at the enemy. So those are the interesting things that have come out of those evaluations. And on that point, I'd just rest that there is merit in examining the works of some of these academics that have been working up in that space.
Let me just conclude with this, because it's worth interjecting. If you look at places like Brazil, which is trying to stay neutral on this, the Communist Party of Brazil is a Stalinist party. It's integral to the coalition that underpins Lula's regime. They are entirely pro-Russian, and they are young. So whereas the Russian youth may be swinging away from Putin, in a lot of countries that are suffering the terminal effects of neoliberalism, there's been a resurgence of Marxist thought and a rise in support for leftist parties, including traditional leftist parties. And interestingly, that has led to the resurgence of the BRICS. See, everyone talks about how Russia caused NATO to find its reason for being. And now NATO's revitalized and expanded. Well, the same thing is going on with the so-called BRICS. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They were dead in the water 5 years ago. We're not going anywhere. Now they're back, and they're thinking of forming a currency union, a market unto themselves. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, led an African delegation to talk with the Ukrainians and then with Putin himself about a peace deal. So the irony is that NATO may have been revitalized by this war, but so too has the major multinational organization for the global South, which are the BRICS. And a lot of that comes from the upswell in left-leaning political sentiment throughout the global South because of the ravages of neoliberal globalization. I don't like to use that term. I'd say, market-driven, whatever. But we're really right now in a stage of global flux, and it's not the West that is necessarily prevailing, at least when we look over the long term.
Yeah, well put. And, the interesting thing is in that too is the redefinitions of the left-right axis, isn't it, Paul, in many respects? Let's park the program. And thank you to Paul for your contribution today and once again sifting through a lot of this actual minefield. And this is right in our alley, isn't it? This kind of thing of getting rid of the disinformation, trying to find a fact-based thing and then applying analysis to that and forming a view of what the realisms are. So thanks again, Paul, and also thanks to those that have been joining us live during the recording of this podcast. Your contributions have been great. I've been bringing up on screen some of those. For those that want to follow it even further, go across to YouTube and see the conversation as it appears in real time, and you can still contribute by engaging there if you so choose to do so. We will be back in 2 weeks from now, so on New Zealand timeline it's Thursday around midday in 2 weeks time, and in the United States eastern side that would be 8 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. So until that time, thank you again for your company. Thank you again for your investment in time and listening to Paul and I dig into this most interesting and important issue. Goodbye, ka kite anō, take care out there.